Tamaulipas, Mexico, 1976. Jesús Enrique Rejón Aguilar was not born into the drug trade. He was born into uniforms, orders, and weapons. His childhood was carved by the military presence that surrounded northern Mexico. The desert winds carried the sound of boots on gravel, rifles slung over young shoulders, the illusion that order could be imposed on chaos. And for a boy like Rejón, there were only two futures: become prey to the violence around him, or learn to master it. He chose the latter. At a young age, he entered the ranks of the Mexican army. A disciplined recruit, obedient, precise. He did not question orders. He executed them. That obedience earned him entry into the elite, GAEF, Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales. There, he was sharpened like a blade. GAEF soldiers were trained differently. Counterinsurgency, guerrilla tactics, survival in mountains, jungles, deserts. They learned to dismantle enemies in silence, to strike with surgical brutality. They were not ordinary men. They were instruments designed for war. Rejón thrived in that world. His body hardened, his mind adapted. His loyalty, for a time, belonged to the flag. Mexico asked him to fight its enemies, and he delivered. But inside, a different seed was growing, a hunger not just for discipline, but for power. Because in GAEF, he saw the truth. Soldiers were strong, but they were expendable. Politicians gave the orders, generals took the credit, and the men in the mud bled for salaries that could barely feed their families. And Rejón began to ask himself, why fight for a state that didn't fight for me? By the 1990s, Mexico's drug cartels were transforming. They didn't want street killers anymore. They didn't want reckless gangsters. They wanted professionals. Men who could hold a rifle with military discipline, who could execute ambushes like a battlefield maneuver. The Gulf Cartel was watching. Its leader, Osiel Cardenas Guillen, understood something that few others did at the time. The future of organized crime wasn't just in money or drugs. It was in military strategy. He wanted a private army, one that could stand against rivals, against police, even against the state itself. And that's where Rejón appeared. He was not just another soldier, he was a model, a template. He embodied what the Gulf Cartel dreamed of: discipline fused with brutality, order applied to crime. He represented the bridge between old-school narcos and the new era of militarized cartels. For Rejón, the offer was simple but irresistible. The state had given him skills. The cartel promised him rewards. With the army, he was a tool. With the cartel, he would be a commander. The expiration date on his loyalty to the flag had arrived. Jesús Enrique Rejón Aguilar took his training, his discipline, his secrets, and crossed the line. He did not walk away from the military. He weaponized it. And in that moment, the foundations of Los Zetas were born. Because the Gulf Cartel didn't want thugs with guns, they wanted professionals, and Rejón was exactly that. 1990s. The Gulf Cartel stood at a crossroads. Its leader, Osiel Cardenas Guillen, was surrounded by enemies. Rival cartels stalked his routes. Corrupt police shifted allegiances with every bribe. The Mexican state itself was beginning to pressure his empire. He had money. He had drugs. But what he lacked was loyalty he could trust. Cardenas understood a truth few narcos dared to admit. Money bought killers. But killers without discipline were nothing but wasted bullets. He didn't need more thugs. He needed an army, soldiers, professionals. And the Mexican military had already trained them. Jesús Enrique Rejón Aguilar was inside that world. A GAEF soldier. A man sculpted by war, sharpened by training that most criminals couldn't even imagine. Jungle survival, ambush tactics, intelligence gathering, counterinsurgency. His uniform carried the weight of the state, but his heart was already drifting. Cardenas's whisper found him. The offer was simple. Come with me. Trade the flag for fortune. For Rejón, it was not just about money. It was about respect. In the army, he was a disposable tool. In the cartel, he would be indispensable. A man who commanded, not obeyed. A man who shaped wars, not fought them blindly. But he didn't defect alone. That was his genius. He moved like a recruiter, a prophet. He spoke to the other disillusioned Gaif soldiers, men who had bled for salaries that could not feed their children, men who had learned to kill with precision but received nothing in return. To them, he whispered the same promise. With the state, you are pawns. With us, you will be kings. And they followed him. One by one, they stripped off uniforms, abandoned barracks, and crossed into the shadows. Not deserters, not criminals. Something new, something far more dangerous. They became Los Zetas. At first, they were the armed wing of the Gulf Cartel, bodyguards, enforcers, escorts for convoys that carried cocaine across borders. But almost immediately, their presence changed the game. They moved in formation. They spoke in codes. They carried radios, heavy weapons, military-grade equipment that ordinary sicarios had never touched. They executed ambushes with the precision of battlefield maneuvers. On the streets, they looked like ghosts in black uniforms, faces covered, movements synchronized, killing without hesitation. Their reputations spread faster than bullets. Los Zetas were not just another group of hitmen. They were a private army, organized, disciplined, ruthless, unstoppable. The cartel war was no longer a matter of who sold more drugs. It became a war of strategy, logistics, firepower. And behind this transformation was Rejón, the soldier who had defected and who had brought the army with him. The state had trained them to fight guerrillas. Now they turned those same tactics against the state. Every roadblock, every ambush, every public execution carried a message written in blood. Mexico was no longer battling criminals. It was battling soldiers who had switched sides. Jesús Enrique Rejón Aguilar had crossed a line few dared to cross. He didn't just betray the uniform, he weaponized it. The defection was complete, and Mexico would never be the same. Jesús Enrique Rejón Aguilar wasn't loud. He wasn't flamboyant. He wasn't a man of corridos or gold chains. He was structure. And structure was exactly what Los Zetas needed. At first, they were just the armed wing of the Gulf Cartel, enforcers for Ociel Cárdenas Guillén. But under Rejón's guidance, they began to evolve, to mutate into something the world had never seen before. He brought order where there had only been chaos, rules where there had only been greed, strategy where there had only been impulse. For Rejón, every operation was a military exercise. Every ambush had a plan. Every killing had a purpose. Under his hand, Los Zetas created a new language of war. Convoys of armored trucks rolled across highways, bristling with mounted machine guns. Safe houses became barracks, outfitted with surveillance equipment, radios, encrypted communications. Recruitment mirrored military structure, ranks, training camps, indoctrination. They trained new sicarios like soldiers, firing drills, tactical maneuvers, night raids. No more street thugs with shaky hands. Now, the cartel's killers moved in formation, cleared rooms with precision, and executed ambushes with cold efficiency. But discipline wasn't their only weapon. Fear was. Public executions became theater. Victims hung from bridges, left headless in plazas, stacked in piles on highways. These weren't random acts of savagery, they were psychological warfare. Every corpse was a message. Los Zetas are everywhere. Obey or disappear, and it worked. Communities fell silent. Rivals retreated. Police stations emptied overnight. The state itself began to fear entering entire regions. For the first time, cartels weren't just criminals. They were insurgents. Los Zetas blurred the line between organized crime and paramilitary insurgency. They taxed local businesses like an occupying army. They controlled territory like a shadow government. Their brutality was unmatched, but so was their discipline. Mexico's streets became battlefields. Cities turned into war zones. Convoys of black trucks with tinted windows became symbols of death. Ordinary people learned to look away, to stay silent, to survive another day. And through it all, Rejón remained in the shadows. He wasn't the loudest voice. He wasn't the most visible figure, but he was the architect, the strategist, the one who transformed a cartel's hired guns into a professional army of terror. The Gulf Cartel had wanted protection. What Rejón built instead was evolution. Los Zetas were no longer bodyguards. They were the storm, a military machine built inside the underworld, operating with precision, fueled by fear, and unleashed upon a country unprepared for soldiers who no longer fought for the state, but against it. And at the center of that storm was Jesús Enrique Rejón Aguilar, silent, calculated, unflinching. He didn't just build a cartel, he built a battlefield. When Oziel Cardenas Guillen was arrested in 2003, the Gulf Cartel lost more than a leader. It lost gravity. The force that held everything together suddenly disappeared, and cracks began to spread through the empire. The cartel weakened. The leadership was fractured, indecisive, scrambling to keep hold of roots and influence. But while the Gulf struggled, their armed wing, the Zetas, was stronger than ever. Los Zetas had been created to serve, to obey, to protect the boss. But years of training, years of bloodshed, had transformed them into something far more powerful. They were no longer bodyguards. They were commanders in their own right. And they asked themselves a dangerous question. Why take orders when we can give them? The break was gradual at first. Los Zetas demanded more autonomy, more freedom of action, more profits from the trafficking routes they controlled. Soon, they were running independent operations, kidnapping businessmen, extorting towns, stealing oil from pipelines. Each act made them less dependent on the Gulf Cartel. Each peso earned made them more confident. By 2010, the divorce was official. The Zetas split. No longer the right hand of the Gulf Cartel. Now, their own cartel, independent, savage. And with independence came a new level of brutality. They diversified. Kidnapping was no longer just ransom. It became a steady business model. Extortion wasn't occasional. It was institutionalized. Attacks on every store, every truck, every business that dared to operate in their territory. Fuel theft from Pemex pipelines brought them millions. They didn't just traffic drugs, they bled the country dry. Violence wasn't just a tool, it was their brand. Entire towns were terrorized into obedience. Rivals weren't just killed, they were dismembered, dissolved in acid, displayed as warnings. Massacres replaced targeted killings. The Zetas wanted to be feared on a national scale, and they succeeded. Jesús Enrique Rejón Aguilar stood among the architects of this evolution. The soldier who had once defected was now a general. He had taken military discipline and twisted it into a blueprint for terror. But generals attract attention, and attention burns. The government, already pressured by the United States, could no longer ignore Los Zetas. Every massacre made headlines. Every kidnapping scandalized the public. The brutality that gave the Zetas power also painted a target on their backs, and Rejón knew it. He had built a monster, but monsters are not invisible. They roar, they leave footprints, they demand notice. The betrayal of the Gulf Cartel had given Los Zetas freedom, but that freedom came with a cost. They were now at war with their former masters, at war with rival cartels, at war with the state. Mexico was no longer just fighting drug traffickers. It was fighting insurgents, an army turned against its own people. And at the center of that betrayal, guiding the division, was Jesús Enrique Rejón Aguilar, the soldier turned general, the architect of defection turned architect of independence. The Zetas had stepped out of the shadows, and now the fire was coming for them. By the late 2000s, the legend of Los Zetas had reached its peak. They were no longer whispers in the underworld. They were front-page news, a nightmare that bled from Mexico's northern border all the way to its southern jungles. Massacres piled on massacres. Journalists vanished. Politicians bent or broke under their shadow. The United States was watching closely. Washington had labeled Los Zetas not just a cartel, but a terrorist-style organization. Their reach wasn't limited to cocaine shipments. They were stealing oil, controlling towns, kidnapping migrants, destabilizing entire regions. For the U.S., that wasn't just crime, it was national security. Pressure on Mexico's government mounted. Every atrocity demanded a response. Every headline screamed that the state was losing control. And at the center of it all, intelligence reports kept circling back to the same name, Jesús Enrique Rejón Aguilar, the soldier turned defector, the architect of the Zetas, the man who had taught criminals to fight like soldiers and soldiers to kill like criminals. The hunt began. Federal forces, guided by U.S. intelligence, tracked his movements. Rejón had been careful, but even disciplined men leave trails. Phones tapped, informants flipped, safe houses compromised. Each week, the circle grew tighter. Then, in July 2011, it closed. Mexico State, a quiet house on the outskirts. No convoys, no last stand, no blazing firefight to cement the myth. When authorities moved in, they found Rejón inside, calm, resigned, aware that the net had finally closed around him. There was no resistance, no dramatic escape. The man who had once built convoys of death surrendered without a bullet fired. It was a striking contrast. The architect of massacres, the general of an army of terror, now reduced to a single prisoner in handcuffs. The Mexican government paraded him before cameras, a trophy meant to prove that the state was still in control. But behind the images lay a deeper reality. This was not just another arrest. This was the capture of one of the men who had redefined organized crime in Mexico. Soon after, he was handed to the United States, extradited, stripped of power, stripped of soldiers, stripped of the empire he had helped build. In courtrooms, his name carried weight. He wasn't just accused of drug trafficking. He was exposed as one of the founders of the most violent cartel in Mexican history. Prosecutors described him not as a trafficker, but as a warlord, a man who had militarized the drug trade and left a trail of bodies across two nations. The symbolism was undeniable. Jesús Enrique Rejón Aguilar, the soldier who had betrayed his flag, the strategist who had built Los Zetas into a paramilitary cartel, the man who had turned Mexico's streets into battlefields, was now a prisoner of the state he had once abandoned. No army, no command, no escape. The man who once built armies was now locked behind bars, and in that silence, one truth became clear. Even generals can fall. Today, Jesús Enrique Rejón Aguilar is a shadow in custody. His name barely makes headlines anymore. His face has faded from the news cycle. Behind concrete walls, in the custody of the very governments he once defied, he is silent. But silence is not the same as absence, because the army he helped create, Los Zetas, still leaves scars across Mexico. Even broken, even divided, the shadow of their terror lingers. The original Zetas fractured under pressure, but their splinters did not disappear. They multiplied. Groups like the Northeast Cartel and the old-school Zetas carry the same DNA. Discipline turned into brutality, military precision twisted into criminal enterprise. Every one of these groups is a fragment of Rejón's original vision. The blood feuds that rage across Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, Coahuila, they are echoes of his design. The massacres that stain Mexico's soil, from San Fernando to Allende, bear the fingerprints of a soldier who taught killers to move like platoons and to treat fear as a weapon. Because Rejón didn't just sell drugs, he weaponized discipline. He militarized fear. Before Los Zetas, cartels were smugglers who hired muscle. After Los Zetas, they were armies. The rules of the game changed forever. Convoys of armored trucks, black uniforms, tactical radio networks, public executions staged as psychological warfare, those were his innovations, his legacy. Even today, years after his capture, convoys of killers still march to his rhythm. The formations, the ambushes, the rituals of terror. They are echoes of military drills once taught in barracks, now rewritten for cartel battlefields. Rejón's downfall did not erase his impact. If anything, it cemented it. By the time he was captured, his blueprint had already spread. Other cartels, CJNG, the Sinaloa factions, smaller regional groups, adopted Zeta tactics. The entire underworld learned from his model. And so, in a dark irony, even as Rejón sits in a cell, his influence walks free. Every execution filmed for terror, every massacre designed not just to kill, but to control. Every town that bows to an armed convoy. They are all part of his afterlife. He was trained to defend a nation. Instead, he trained an army that tore it apart. That is his legacy. Not just the crimes committed in his name, but the system he created. One where the line between soldier and criminal, between war and business, between state and cartel, no longer exists. Jesús Enrique Rejón Aguilar may be forgotten by many, but Mexico still bleeds from the wounds he carved, because monsters die, but their blueprints live on. He was trained to defend a nation. Instead, he trained an army that tore it apart.